It all started with a very simple idea. Tell the stories of how successful middle market CEOs made it to the corner office. I'm Brant Handley, founder and managing director of Resource Options International, or ROI. We're the USA's premier executive search firm focused exclusively on empowering middle market companies to attract, hire, and retain A players while transforming top executives' careers and lives. ROI's Into the Corner office is dedicated to discovering how middle market CEOs advance their career, and we're making these remarkable and sometimes quite unbelievable stories available to you for the very first time. Listen and learn about the challenges they've overcome, the interesting people they've met along the way, and the lessons learned that steered these executives' unique journey into a middle market corner office of their own. I know you enjoy these CEO stories as much as I've enjoyed recording them. So thank you for listening today. And if you like what you've heard, rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm looking forward to you joining me on the next great middle market CEO adventure into the corner office. My guest today is Sir Stephen Wilkinson, founder and CEO of Good and Prosper. Stephen has been involved in business, finance, and investment for the best part of 30 years, having started working for Merrill Lynch Investment Bank in Munich in Germany in 1987 at the tender age of 24. Good and Prosper is an investment company and a knowledge platform teaching finance to entrepreneurs with a focus that's always been on small and medium-sized businesses, primarily in Germany and Europe, and mostly in some sort of distress or need of restructuring. In 2015, Stephen was invited to join an interfaith delegation of the Caribbean island state of Grenada, whose purpose was to coordinate a number of reconstruction and redevelopment projects for infrastructure seriously damaged by hurricanes a decade earlier. As part of that delegation, representing the Anglican community, he was awarded with an honor bestowed by the Governor General into the Order of the Nation of Grenada with the rank of Knight Commander. Stephen believes that business can and should be a force of good in our society, and that the more people take entrepreneurial responsibility for their lives, the better our society will be. Sir Stephen Wilkinson, welcome into the corner office.
Thank you, Brent. I'm honored to be on your show.
It's great to have you here, and I think you're at your lovely home in Ireland at the moment. Is that correct?
I am. Yep. It's
all right. Well, we're
pitch black outside, but when the sun's shining, which it does sometimes, I have a lovely view.
Well, in New York City, we'll have a couple hours more of sun, and that's pretty much the same thing. So waving to you across the Atlantic, and so wonderful to get a chance to record this with you. We met last summer in Oxford at the wonderful Moonshots conference, and we'll touch on that because I know you're very involved in the Birthing of Giants organization. But we always like to kind of start our podcast at the beginning and hear a little bit about your early family life. So tell us, where were you born and raised, and what were the kind of influences you had in your life? I know there's a deeper entertainment background. We'll probably touch on that with your grandfather, but what did mom and dad do, and in what part of the world did you grow up in?
I grew up in a bilingual household in the north of Lancashire on the west coast of England. So northwest, opposite Dublin, more or less, if you cross the Irish Sea. And I come from a business family, but bilingual because my father married a German girl, my mother, in the beginning of the 1960s, which was interesting and influential for me for two reasons. Firstly, my mother was not from a business family. She came from a fairly ordinary family in rural Bavaria. And so sort of being thrust into a business family was probably quite frightening for her. Firstly, and secondly, her English wasn't very good. Yeah. So I grew up as the eldest of three children at the point where my mother was probably at her least confident in the English language, and therefore spent an inordinate amount of time with us and talked German to me. So I learned to understand German and probably talk German at a very early age, which not quite as much from my brothers and sisters, I don't think, because my mother's English, of course, after a couple of years of being there, got much better. And I think in the early 1960s, life for a German in the
even
north of
post-war. Yeah.
England, which was sort of culturally at least a decade behind the south and London, was probably quite a difficult thing to be.
Yeah.
So I think she
Yeah, I
kept
can
very
imagine.
much to herself, and that meant that we had a very intense family life at home. My mother's a great homemaker, and we had a delightful childhood. My grandfather was a tech entrepreneur, and
Right.
his tech
Right.
was radio and television
Yeah.
in the 1940s and
Rediffusion,
50s.
as I understand, right?
Telefusion was the name of the business,
Telefusion, right? Right.
and he was one of the pioneers, and I think the pioneer of the hire purchase model
Right. Right.
um, for that technology in those days. So conversations at my father was a brilliant mathematician, left university with a law degree, business and commerce, and went to work for my grandfather fairly quickly. They went
Okay.
public
Using the business. Yeah.
um, very early for a family business. So I grew up in a household where business was talked about a lot,
All the
um,
time. Yeah.
all
Yeah.
the time. So I was
Right.
immersed in it. But my first love has always been language and literature, um, and that informed my school career and has been the the backdrop to my inner life ever since I was a child. So
Did
language,
you grow up in the
literature,
public school system or
system.
private school system?
Well,
Yeah.
the private school system in England is confusingly called the public school system,
Right.
um,
Right.
for the simple reason that if you paid, you could go there, so it was open to everybody who could pay. And the state school system was one that you had to go to the school that was in your area, more or less.
Right.
So,
Right.
but yes, I was educated privately
Yeah.
and was
And
sent away to school at the age of 8 with all the psychological damage that does to
a
a
boarding school
sensitive
environment,
child.
right?
Yeah.
And then, did you finish your education in the UK as well,
I
or did you
I did
have some education in
I
Germany?
did I finished it in the UK, but I had a couple of years at university in Germany.
Right, right. Good
So
student during those years?
appalling.
I don't believe that for a minute.
It is very true because um, I didn't really want to go because I was enjoying working so much. I
Right,
had got a really interesting job in London, and actually I wanted to stay there and work because I loved earning money, and having independence. And at that stage, it was um, it, my, I hadn't really thought very much about a career, not really,
right.
and because
Was there some
from the
pressure to go into the family
oh,
business,
there
or was
absolutely
that,
there was. I mean,
yeah,
it was not
yeah.
just
I mean, you're
pressure.
the
It
oldest
was
son, right?
I was the
Yeah,
oldest son. There was a great
expected.
deal of rivalry between my father's side of the family and his sister about who was going to be the next, managing director of the
Yeah,
company, and it was either me or
right,
my cousin. And we got up. My cousin and I got on very well, and we promised each other we would never fight over that.
right.
And so it was never really. I didn't really ever feel as if I had an option.
Huh,
If you ask my father today, he would say, "Well, of course he did," but it didn't feel like that. Um,
right, right.
and and so I, he sort of gave me an ultimatum and said, well, you're not coming into the business without a degree. So I went to university, but it was sort of under protest, um,
Hmm.
because I actually wanted to work and get out on my own. And in the last
Well,
year of my attendance at university, I my father sold the business, um,
interesting. Huh.
which did something very odd with me. It it felt as if I can remember it exactly. I remember exactly where I was when I heard the news, and I
Huh.
remember what I felt, and it felt as though the entire backdrop, that I was standing on a stage,
Hmm.
and that the entire backdrop had suddenly disappeared, and I was completely exposed behind me, and
Wow, I
I
can
didn't
imagine.
know really what I was doing on that particular stage, and it led to a great deal of disorientation. Uh, and it was only when it disappeared as an option that the sort of full panoply of
The
of,
landscape
of
changed.
the well of the optionality of everything suddenly
Interesting.
appeared, and I wasn't prepared for it. I didn't know what to do with
Yeah.
that much choice. Um, and I think one of the things that I regret most, if I look back on my life, is not having a mentor or somebody
Mm.
that I could talk to at that stage.
Yeah.
And
Well, what did you do? I mean, how did you kind of then make that next stage, or move on to the next landscape, so to
I
speak?
did, I created the only certainty that I could think of, and that was I got married.
Okay.
I did. I got married. I got
Yeah.
married because I needed some semblance of order,
Right.
and I needed something that I recognized because all this optionality, I wasn't prepared, having spent 12 or 10 years in a school system where
Right.
everything is regulated,
Right.
and
Right.
and I was very successful at school. I was a good student, and I did a lot of things, and and I was successful in in the way that you can be successful at school. The system worked for me. A lot of friends. I did stuff. I was um, editor of the school magazine and turned it round and made it profitable. And so, but it was all within a very well ordered structure. And
Yeah.
when that
Yeah.
disappeared, um, I now recognize that I wasn't really prepared for optionality in life.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
getting married was sort of gave me some structure. And then I
Right.
set up my first business,
Mm.
and because that was evidently genetically programmed
Sure.
that
Sure.
that's what you
You've
did.
been groomed for that your
Yeah,
whole life.
yeah.
And what was that first business?
Well, I don't even know what I was supposed to be doing. I was what 21 at the time.
Right.
I suppose you would call it a consultancy, but what I was doing was mimicking my first boss, who was a precocious genius at the age of, he was in his early 30s, and he had been in the area up in the northeast where I was, and he was running an amazingly successful, vibrant consultancy down in London, and I was working as his
Huh.
assistant. And that was the business that I didn't want to leave to go to university for, because I was learning so much from him and from
Right.
that
Right.
environment. And there was some very later there were some very exciting people who were coming through that as juniors and as consultants who went on to do great things afterwards. And it was a fabulous environment, and I didn't want to miss it. So what I did was sort of recreate it because it was the only role model that
Huh.
I had.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I set myself the task of meeting the 100 most important people in the Northeast, which is
Oh.
Newcastle and the area. And
Right.
I didn't actually have a business concept or a business model, but I knew that I was good at meeting people and connecting with people. So I did that.
Right.
And within 6 months, everybody who was anybody there knew who I was. I
Huh.
just was precocious, and I was a really good networker. The only thing is I didn't know what to do with it. So I I'd proved something to myself that I could meet. I only had two names to start with, two names, and I reckoned that I could, by sheer dint of asking, who else do I need to talk to if I want to talk to the
Right.
most important people here? Within 6 months, the rice board, the chessboard, the rice corn on the chessboard compounding effect had meant that I had personal introductions to the 100 people who those the other 50 thought were worth talking to, starting with
Right.
two names. And I learned a lot from that exercise. And when I got married, which I was in the middle, I was sort of got married in that phase. My my then wife said, "This is not really producing very much income,
I
is
was
it?
going to say,
So,
what is your
what
job again?
what's your job? How do you plan on feeding us?" And that's when I decided that it would probably be a good idea to get a job and learn something of value. And I had two options. One of them was one of them was from a company that you may have heard of called Hanson Trust, because they were the first. They were an early version of a private equity company, but they were publicly traded,
Right. Mm-hmm.
and they were very strong. One of the few British companies to be successful in the US and in the UK, and one of the partners was a chap called Lord Hanson, or Sir James Hanson as he was,
Mm-hmm.
I think, at that stage. And his other partner was Sir Gordon White, or Lord White as he became. And Lord White
Right.
went over and became very famous um, in the US, lived in Los Angeles, was a great wheeler dealer doing deals for Hanson Trust. And he became sort of immortalized in the first Wall Street film as,
Ah,
I think, Terence Stamp played his character, and he was sort of a suntanned white shirt Los Angeles sort of businessman playboy who has a role in that first Wall Street film. Anyway,
right. Right.
that business had a battery factory up in in the northeast, and I applied for a position because I thought it was quite a sexy business, and I knew Lord Hanson through my father and my grandfather, with whom he had business dealings, and I'd always been
Right.
fascinated by him. And so I thought that's a sexy thing to do. So I applied for a job there, and I was offered a job as a trainee manager in a battery factory in the northeast of England, which belonged to
Wow.
their portfolio, with the idea of sort of learning the ropes and working my
Yeah.
way up through the organization, and hopefully ending up at some stage in the hallowed halls of Mayfair down
Their
in London,
headquarters. Yeah. Yeah.
where James Hansen worked. And
Right.
the other job that I was offered was as a trainee investment banker for Merrill Lynch, who
Uh-huh.
in those days, it was 1987. It was a year after Big Bang. The America,
Yeah.
which was the freeing up of the City of London, that in the finance industry, the Americans had sort of invaded in force in the second
Right.
half of 1986, buying up all the large UK brokers, stock jobbers, investment houses, most of them anyway, merchant banks, and were expanding rapidly on the back of a strong dollar into Europe. And so, if you could tie a tie and had a pair of hands, a left one and a right one, you were pretty much, and were reasonably
Guaranteed a job.
presentable. You were pretty much sure
Yeah.
of a job. And so
Right.
I got a job. I took the job in Munich, which is where my first wife was from, um, because she was homesick and hated it in the northeast, and that seemed to me the better prospect of battery factory manager in the northeast,
Yeah.
um,
Much better.
or a fun job in finance in Munich, and that sort of sealed it for me. And my
Yeah.
parents and my family were horrified. They thought there was nobody less qualified from this character to be in finance than me, because I was a poet and a writer, and I liked
Right.
other things, and had never shown any interest in financial matters whatsoever. And I would have had to agree with them, but the mere fact that they thought that I couldn't was a pretty good spur for
That
me
was a
to
good motivator.
to do it. And
So
so
was your
off I
German fluent enough to go and work there, or did it become fluent, I guess, once
it was
once you
fluent enough. And remember, it
yeah,
was Merrill
yeah,
Lynch,
yeah.
and it was they just assumed that everybody spoke English anyway.
Right,
Um,
right,
and my German was good enough. It was good enough.
right,
It was, I would probably have told you then I was fluent, and I probably was more fluent than most, and certainly fluent enough. And I went for what I thought would be 2 years, and ended up staying 28. Um,
yeah.
and once I left, I think the quite funny little incident that I told you, my parents were convinced that there was no industry to which I was less suited than the financial industry.
Financial
Um,
management.
and I joined Merrill Lynch International Bank as a baby broker and investment banker in late summer of 1987. So we're talking sort of June, maybe 1st of September, something like that, my first day at work.
Right.
And of course, on the 19th of October, 6 weeks into my tenure, markets crashed.
The big crash, yeah.
The big,
25, 30% down, as I recall. Yeah.
28% on
Yeah.
that Friday.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and on Monday, I got a letter from my father, which just had a clipping from that day's Wall Street Journal of the Saturdays. And he'd just written caustically in a pencil on the graph showing this massive collapse. Now look what you've done.
Thanks, Dad, for the encouragement.
which sort of, I think, encapsulated his confidence in my suitability for the job. But
But you
anyway,
stayed
I
in that
stayed.
industry.
I did.
Yeah,
Well,
you
I had
stayed
to
in
stay
for
for
a
two
number of years.
years at Merrill
Right.
to pay back the cost of tuition.
Right.
Um,
Right.
you had to, you had to make as much commission as you could without blushing, um,
Right.
and
Right.
to pay
Right.
back your 40,000 or whatever it cost to train me.
Your dues. Yeah.
And
Yeah. Right.
I did that reasonably quickly and realized rapidly that it really wasn't my world, but I was fascinated by finance.
Yeah.
I was genuinely fascinated by what I was learning, not just the mechanics of it, but the whole sort of meta embedding of finance into economics and economics into society, and understanding how things flow together. And I started reading avidly um, around the the big economists of the past, and my luck, as luck would have it, the very first investing book that I read that came about as a pure coincidence was The Intelligent Investor. And I think in much the same way
Ah,
that your first boss sets the tone for much of how you
right.
think about work,
Right.
so too the first in investment, the first influence that you have determines your trajectory. And I was just very fortunate in coming across Benjamin Graham through
Ah,
a serendipitous discovery of Berkshire Hathaway and finding the language very accessible and the spirit in which it was written very accessible. And
mm,
Seth Klarman, the great value investor from Baupost, wrote in his book, Margin of Safety, value investing is something you either get immediately, it resonates immediately, or you never understand it.
yeah. Right.
And
Right.
with me, it resonated immediately
Yeah. Yeah.
because it must have triggered an association with business, and that
Yeah.
I understood intuitively without really understanding it properly until much later, that what I was interested in was business, and that
Right.
the the discovery of a of an investment philosophy that treated treated stocks and equities not as pieces of paper to be traded, but as businesses to be understood
Mm,
and partnerships to be entered into, that that struck a deep chord with me, and it's one that has informed my thinking around
well,
business and the world of finance ever since.
it sounds like it's a through line to your upbringing, right? Because business was always discussed around the dinner table, and your father and grandfather and being a part of that. So I could see how that was a through
I
line
think
to
it
Good and
was,
Prosper. So
but it
yeah.
meant, and I'll to try and be as brief as possible on this. It meant um, sort of wanting to prove to my family that you know that I that I was doing something worthwhile rather than the thing that I loved doing, which was writing and literature, which
Right.
I sort of put
Right.
in a box and pushed away. I'm going to say when I left school. Um, Finding a way back to that has been the work of 30 years.
Well, Good and Prosper was first established in Germany, right, in the late 90s.
No, Good and Prosper itself was a relatively new invention. That was something that I created when we moved to Ireland
Okay,
in
got it.
2015. I wasn't quite sure what to do with it to start with. I had other business interests in Germany, um, through sort of leftovers from my restructuring work and investments in that field. Um, and Good and Prosper was a sort of new venture or a new business that I set up as a with the idea of doing something completely
Mm,
different and hoping that I could use use it to write in some form or another. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that, but it was at the time when I was starting to notice that people were writing blogs and creating content and building very substantial businesses with very little capital around that, and using their intellectual capital as the driving force behind the
right.
business. And I found that hugely
Yeah.
appealing. And I thought this would be a good time to try that out. So that was what Good and Prosper was there for. And Good and Prosper, the name came simply from my conviction, um, that you don't have to hang your ethics, you don't have to check them in the cloakroom if you want to be
Mm,
successful and prosperous
yeah.
in business. In fact, quite the opposite. But it was something that it was a mindset that I'd encountered in Germany a lot, but also in the Anglo-Saxon world, that somehow if you wanted to be successful in business, you had to be
Right.
cutthroat
Brutal. Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
brutal, and my experience was was exactly the opposite. That if you wanted to be that investing in business was more like gardening, and that you had to have a concept and constantly
Right.
tend to the soil and the
Yeah.
biosphere by looking
Right.
after it if you wanted to be truly successful. And truly successful in a garden is having something that flourishes and that you can harvest every year
Right.
without diminishing it.
Well, it sounds like it was a real convergence of your love of literature as well, right? And your understanding of the arts and kind of bringing those two
Well, it
together.
didn't come until and didn't actually start until
Yeah.
2020.
Okay.
So I had to wait five
Yeah. Yeah.
years, and it was the pandemic that gave me the push, because we were sitting at home end of March, twiddling our thumbs on what was a beautiful spring in Ireland. And I had this realization that if you don't start now, you will never start.
Right. Right.
Um, and so I started writing a newsletter with, I don't know, 20 people on a list. I had no idea where that list had come from. People who'd set up my little website had linked me to MailChimp, so I just used that. And I did that I've started that in March 2020, and I've been publishing every Friday for the last 2 and 3/4
Yeah.
years. I think it'll be 3 years this March. I've got a substantial subscriber set. That's how Grant came
Okay.
across me.
All right.
Um, and and the writing led to interviews with people who were interested in hearing my take on stuff that I've been writing about at the intersection of finance, business, history, literature, and leadership. Um, just reflecting on stuff and telling stories. And it took me a while to find my voice, but I think I've found one now that I'm comfortable with. And that's led to all sorts of other writing projects and teaching projects. And so, that's so I've come full circle and reconciled 30 years of investing in business experience
I love it.
with what I should have been doing probably 35 years ago.
And the Birthing of Giants Fellowship Program's been part of that. That's how we met. And is that how you connected with them? Was it through your writing and your blogging?
No, that came through another pet project of mine, which is financial literacy.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I've noticed right from the beginning, when I was dealing with private companies mainly, the owners and sort of German Mittelstand companies were not what I would call financially literate. They
Right.
didn't use their accounts to to advise and draw insights on their business. They had very rudimentary ideas of what the balance sheet and P&L were there for, and often couldn't read them at all, which, as the poet Olson wrote in his wonderful piece I Maximus, has made for difficulties. And that made for difficulties, and it was something that I wanted to cure, and I found that I was really good at explaining the concepts of business finance to people who didn't have a clue and weren't terribly interested, but knew they ought to know something about it.
Right.
And that led me to create a number of memes, so simple mental models for getting them to understand, how all these things fitted together without using any accounting language. And because I've been an advocate for financial literacy in business and entrepreneurship, that has brought me in touch with a number of different people, one of whom was Lewis Schiff, who was founder of the Birthing of Giants organization, who liked my idea of creating a benchmark for business owners just to measure their progress in a very simple way. And that's what enticed him. And he found that I was personable enough to be put in front of his audience. So that we established a very productive friendship, and one that I'm delighted. It's an organization I'm delighted to be involved with because it brought us together.
Exactly. Share with us one of those memes that you think's been one of the more powerful ones that
Well, one of the things that I suggested that business owners do, I think I started doing this about 15 years ago, was telling them to create their own stock price, even if they were a private company. And the stock price is a very simple thing everybody can calculate. It's just it's your assets minus your liabilities divided by your share capital, which is effectively nothing other than your book value per share, but with a little wrinkle that I ask business owners to look at all the capital that they've ever put into the business, particularly savings that they may have drawn down while they were setting up the business, so they can get a real handle on how much does it actually cost me to set the business up in the early days, even though I may not have accounted for the real cost of putting the business in. So if you use that as your denominator and divide your net assets through that, you end up with a quota, a quotient of it's going to be a small number, hopefully, and that small number can then act as a stock price because you can measure it every month. Every time your accounts come in, you can do that calculation and you get a series of numbers that move up, down, or sideways. And what I found was if somebody can stick to it for 3 months, that entrepreneurs, because they know what a stock price is, and because stock prices need to go up because otherwise they feel uncomfortable, they have this
metric
line that they want to influence. And what happens then is they start asking questions like, well, how do I get it to go up?
Right.
And it's really, it's a very simple psychological
impacts
trick.
their behavior.
But once they ask that question, they start recognizing how things are connected, and they can start measuring the impact of things that they do in life, in their business, and seeing how that impacts basically net equity.
Right.
Because net equity is the only part of the balance sheet that moves whatever you do. Wherever you're making changes, it will have unless it's just a swap on the asset side or a swap on the liability side. So if it crosses the line between assets and liabilities, or if it impacts the P&L or cash flow, then it will also impact net equity, which is what moves the stock price, if you like. And the rationale behind it is to be found in a publication that used to be available to Berkshire Hathaway shareholders and used to be available on the Berkshire Hathaway website called the Owner's Manual.
Hmm.
And I suspect for compliance reasons it's no longer there, but it was a beautiful little document outlining Buffett and Munger's partnership principles and the basis of their investment and management philosophy. And there was a section at the back of it, section 8, which describes the concept of intrinsic value. And this is important because the very first page on the Berkshire Hathaway annual report for the best part of 57 years were 3 columns of numbers, excluding the date. So there would be the year would be the first column, and then you would have the percentage change in Berkshire's book value, the percentage change in Berkshire's share price for that period, and the percentage change of the S&P 500 with dividends reinvested. And Buffett explains why those 3 columns of numbers are so important. And my thinking, 15, 20 years ago is if the world's most successful investor and business investor thinks that that's important, well, then it may be worthwhile really understanding why he thinks it's important. And in the Owner's Manual, he has this one sentence, which is at the core of that meme, which says, whilst book value per share is a not particularly useful KPI on its own, we do know that the general direction of change of book value is indicative of the change in intrinsic value. So my little stock price meme, building on that wisdom, says it may not be of very much value to you in running your business, and indeed it isn't. But if you concentrate on it, on making sure it continues to grow, then the rate of change at which it is growing will be indicative of the rate of change in intrinsic value. And intrinsic value is what, as a business owner, you are aiming for, because at some stage you're going to have to realize it one way or the other.
That's right. Yeah.
So
awesome. Cool.
Well, so by doing that little exercise every week, you are doing something that Buffett does. And doing stuff that Buffett does is not the stupidest thing you could do.
That's good behavior. Well, Stephen, we're almost out of time. This has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed understanding your career direction and the uncertainty you met and faced, and took the bull by the horns, as we say, and rode that bull to another direction. And we always ask one last question to everyone, and that's what kind of career and life advice would you give someone that maybe had something similar happen to them, where they may be expected to go into a family business, or perhaps decided to go into a career that found out that they hated it and had to make a change. What would you tell that person in terms of kind of getting back to their own corner office someday?
Well, depends whether a corner office is where they want to be.
True. Yeah.
I think I would do 2 things or 3 things depending on where they are in their career. If they were young, I would advise them strongly to find an outstanding mentor as their first boss in whatever career they choose, whether it's carpentry or consultancy.
Right.
Be picky about who you work for first. Really picky. People think at a young age that they can't be, but that's the point at which you need to be at your pickiest, because it can make an enormous difference. The trajectory that you're on, firstly. Secondly, at whatever stage somebody came to me, I would urge them to make sure that their head is not overriding their heart in terms of advising them what they should be doing with their lives. And I believe deeply we all have a purpose, something that we are particularly good at, a talent, a song inside us, and it needs to be sung, because the longer you postpone it, the greater the danger of your being absolutely miserable.
Yeah, losing that voice
at a later stage in life. And there's a reason why the rate of suicide amongst men in the West is at its highest between the age of 50 and 55. It's because the thought that we may have wasted our real talents becomes so unbearable, along with the drained energy that we can do something, the belief that we can do something about it dissipating. That gap between what we think we should have been doing and what we actually did, and our belief in the ability to change, can lead people to give up on life. And the third piece of advice, if they were in anywhere close to that situation, is to say it's rubbish. You can change it on a sixpence. It's difficult in your head, but if you give your heart free rein, given all the experience you've got in life, you've arrived at a place, you know lots of stuff that you didn't know when you were 25, when you can accelerate your change dramatically through applying the wisdom and the lessons that you've learned. It's never wasted.
Yeah, fabulous. Well, Sir Stephen Wilkinson, founder and managing director of Good and Prosper, thank you so much for sharing your journey into the corner office.
Thank you so much, Brent.
Thank you for listening to Into the Corner Office with Brant Hanley. We hope you enjoyed hearing our guest CEO story as much as we did. If you want to hear more CEOs reveal their journey into the corner office, please subscribe via iTunes and tell your friends and colleagues. For more information about Brant, Resource Options International, and the mighty middle market, visit www.goforroi.com. We look forward to having you join us for our next episode.